It's showtime!
In 1989, the cartoon version of Beetlejuice hit the television screen. Based on the strange Tim Burton film starring Michael Keaton in 1988, the cartoon saw heroine Lydia Dietz befriend the antagonistic Ghost with the Most, falling into all kinds of misadventures in the underworld. It was silly, a little crude, and a regular in my 90s after-school cartoon lineup, which included shows like Tiny Toons, Animaniacs, DuckTales, and Tailspin. As for the movie, and for those unfamiliar with this truly bizarre work of pop culture, the premise is as follows. Newlyweds die and are trapped in their house as ghosts with no idea what to do to get an eccentric family out of their house. Neglecting their copy of the handbook for the recently deceased, they embark on a futile attempt to haunt the people away. When they do find their way to the afterlife's waiting room, they are chastised by their caseworker. In their desperation, they come across a bio-exorcist named Beetlejuice, an unhinged character who can only escape into the land of the living if his name is said 3 times. As you may have guessed, they say his name 3 times and chaos ensues. The Dietz's daughter, Lydia, befriends the formerly alive Maitlands, teaming up to shut down Beetlejuice. It's not so much scary as really weird. I didn't realize how weird it was until I tried to explain the movie to my wife, who has never seen the film. We had an invitation to attend a Broadway play from some friends who held season tickets, and the show happened to be Beetlejuice. Yes, it's a real play. Not wanting to turn down time with friends or Broadway tickets, we agreed, and I tried to explain the premise to my wife, who had no idea what this was. The problem was the movie and the cartoon are so different, and I had no idea how it would translate to the stage. It turned out to be a narrative hybrid between the cartoon and movies, and, despite all the wild stage sets and often crude antics, the message was about coping with loss and family. Now, after decades of waiting, the announcement was made for a sequel, Beetlejuice Beetlejuice, which drops on September 6th. Now, for people of faith, this probably does not sound like something to bother with, or worse, a threat to biblical perspectives on death. While movies like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings may get an honorable mention in the sermon or in the sermon title once in a while, fairly certain most preachers aren't going to bless their parishioners with Beetlejuice. But in the past several years, religious scholars and leaders have paid attention to the genre of horror, which, in terms of film, began in the 1890s, but has exploded since then and has captured the attention of both religious detractors and religious supporters. People wonder, how can a genre known for its fantastical portrayal of the supernatural, its penchant for gore and violence, and its characters' violation of every moral code that people of faith try to uphold, be worthy of sacred scholarship and discussion? Which is why I have decided to pair this cultural artifact with another unique media property. Be Afraid is Christianity Today's podcast that looks at the genre of horror and is hosted by Professor Kutter Callaway from Fuller Theological Seminary, and he happens to be our special guest today on Beast and Bible. I'm entitling this episode, It's Showtime, Beetlejuice, Biblical Studies, and Things That Go Bump in the Night. I'm Dr. Seth Pierce, and welcome to Season 2 of Beast and Bible. Kutter, thank you so much for coming on Beast and Bible.
Absolutely. Great to be here.
So let's get right into it here. A Christian podcast on the horror genre. How is that possible?
Well, it's, I guess, a good question, or it's a prototypical question, right? Like everybody asks that. And it's funny because now I've been asked it so many times, I'm sort of like, well, why not a Christian podcast on horror? How could we not do that? And the main reason is because, at least in my mind, and having gone through a number of the different films and TV shows and filmmakers that we've interviewed and talked about, horror really is a unique genre, at least in sort of North American West, that kind of baked into the genre are these questions about spirituality, about religion, about, ghosts and demons and, all these things that are innately spiritual and then even explicitly Christian. So much of the genre itself isn't just about sort of the generic spirituality, but in many cases, what does Christianity, Christian representatives have to do or have to say with some of these great evils and darkness that we face in the world?
Yeah. And how did you get traction to do this with Christianity Today?
Well, as with so many things in my life, in a totally non-strategic kind of happenstance way, I have a partnership with Christianity Today, just, collegially over the years that we've worked with them on some of their media type pieces. And after the success of their Mars Hill podcast, they were wanting to kind of branch out into a few different places and thought myself and some others, because of our location and the stuff we did at Real Spirituality at Fuller Seminary, really kind of set us up to do something in the film and TV world, right? How do Christians engage entertainment media? And at the first couple of rounds of drafts, we started saying we're going to do a scripted thing, which was a little different for me than some of my past podcasting, and a little bit of a journalistic kind of approach. We just started working on some scripts, and it was going to be multiple different genres of film at first. And it just happened that one of the first kind of full scripts we got was on horror. And Eric Petrick, who was executive producer for Mars Hill and for this one, was like, whoa, that's awesome. That should be a whole season. And we're like, really? Okay. And so that was basically it. He just said he saw something in it that was kind of unique and not the norm. And we sort of ran with it. And so the irony of it is that, if anyone listens to the podcast will know, I myself did not start as like a horror fan, and I'm a little, skittish with it. And so as soon as they said go all in on horror, I'm like, what did I agree to here? But it became kind of the narrative plot, right, of me trying to figure out and identify with all those others who might kind of be squeamish or not really enjoy or appreciate horror, kind of putting myself in their shoes and going, is there anything of value in this? And is there something to the people that are telling us, hey, it's great and, you should look into it? And so that sort of became not the shtick, but the setup of me kind of going through this process of asking, even though I don't like it, what might it be that people are engaging and enjoying about it?
I resonate with that a lot. Like I have kind of a weird relationship with horror. My dad was a horror fan and kind of went through a season of, in teenage years, creeping downstairs to watch USA Up All Night and those kind of things. But as a genre, it's not really my thing. Like I don't mind thrillers, eerie, more gothic kind of stuff, but like I'm not, a huge, horror fan. So yeah, kind of stumbling into this and realizing that a lot of people, particularly, I know like a lot of my students who maybe grew up with this dynamic of, you're banned, you can't watch this, it's forbidden, and then sneaking out and watching it and then having all these questions. And it just became a topic that people had this natural interest and tension in. So what kind of feedback have you gotten? And in particular, have you gotten any pushback from the podcast?
Yeah, one benefit of not being a direct employee of Christianity Today is I don't have like a CT email or anything. So no one's sending me hate mail. So I think the folks there have protected me a little bit from maybe some of the worst of the worst. But a few of the things really have to do with kind of what you're saying, just a base level. This is reflecting on things that are dark and not good and not true and unhealthy and unhelpful. So why would you do that? At a base level. And then there's been some others that are saying there are certain parts of the horror genres and specific films that really are gratuitous and unnecessarily so. So some are very exploitative of women and in turning them into sort of sexualized objects, and examples like that where people, I think rightly, were saying, how could you think about the theological significance of this given how bad it is? And there's sort of two responses that I've come up with on those two. One, the whole whatever is good and true and noble and pure needs to account for whatever is true. And my response for people who are engaging any type of media is that sometimes the truth really is horrific. It's terrifying. It's awful. We're recording this right after a pretty crazy weekend in the US with political violence, going, this is a raw, hard truth. I have to think through, how do I talk to my kids about what's happening in the real world? And if I avoid something that is truly horrific, I'm actually going to be doing something opposite of the truth. So how do I communicate truth to them? So that's one thing where I just say, it's not that scary or dark or horrific things are necessarily bad or untrue, but we can't overemphasize the good and the pure and the pleasant at the expense of the true. The other side is, I think, to me, an example of comparing what would be called our best to their worst, right? So if you go, there's certain genres of film that Christians should engage and watch. Well, you're probably comparing the best examples of that genre to the worst examples of another genre. And of course, there are some horrible examples of terrible horror films that I kind of think just nobody should watch. They're not worthwhile. They're not good because of the very things that people complain about. However, there are all sorts of horror films that are actually great examples of the genre that don't fall victim to some of those negatives that people will often sort of latch onto. And because of that, I think the same critique should and could be made of any film and any genre, any actual piece of fiction, literature, film, Broadway play. There's some that are really going to just be kind of exploring and exploiting the worst of us. But then there's some that actually invite us into a conversation, invite us into kind of a moment of reflection about ourselves and humanity. That's really helpful. And so that's kind of the pushback I've gotten is it's either unpure or it's, a terrible genre. And that's kind of how I've responded to both.
Okay, that's good. So staying on this theme, in your first podcast episode, you narrate a story that feels like it might allude to a Hollywood horror or thriller, but as the savvy listener stays with it, it becomes clear that the quote-unquote toilet murder that you describe is King Eglon from Judges 3. And while the Bible is full of horror narrative, the idea of horror still strikes many people, as we've been talking about, as inappropriate subject matter. So how does your approach, your podcast, help people balance the tension between the horrors in the Bible, the horrors produced by Hollywood, and the horrors of everyday life?
I think, the hope is, now, if it's successful, I don't know, but if you stick with the podcast, I think even the way you phrased it is really nice in that the attempt is to say, let's look at each of these sort of, let's call them texts, right? Mm-hmm. You have the biblical text, you have the film or TV text, and then you have your life as sort of a text or source. And I think with any great, no matter what it is, it does something that invites you into that narrative world in a way that you can imagine yourself into it. And then as you kind of come out of it, as you end reading the book or you finish listening to the album or whatever, you then are kind of given a new vision or picture of your life that you can kind of accept or reject. Sometimes you come out and you're like, ooh, no, I fully reject that, vision of the world. But it sheds light on who you are, what it means to be human, how you might relate to other people in the world around you. And I think in both great fiction, but then also in the biblical text with all of these stories, right? It's doing something really similar. But if you sort of sanitize it or scrub it of some of its darker, more gritty elements at the very beginning, it kind of rings hollow. It's not able to do the work that it was written to do. So we have so many stories, and this would of course also change depending upon your age level, your maturity level, your sort of psychological or emotional capacity. Sure. So I'm not going to go do the Judge's toilet murder story to my 3 or 4 year old, right? Like that's not going to be helpful. Or even as maybe more classic, like the Noah's Ark, right? It's this classic, beautiful, felt board, whatever. We keep using that as an analogy. I don't know if anyone actually does felt boards anymore, but
yeah, I was just going to actually bring that up. Felt boards for like the toilet murder. We don't have those.
Yeah, we don't have those. And the reason is because we rightly understand some stories need to be pitched in certain ways to certain audiences, and that's fine. But speaking of adults, like if you're an adult reader of the biblical text, then what you're doing by either ignoring those passages entirely or sort of sanitizing them is you're actually sort of disempowering them to do what they're meant to do. And in Judges, of course, you've got all these stories that are pretty gritty and gruesome of, the phrase starting with, each person did what was right in their own eyes, right? And so what does it mean when humans do that? What does it mean when the people of God do that? Well, sometimes when that happens, not sometimes, often, really violent, horrific, terrifying things occur. And if you sort of, tamp that down and don't address it in its sort of full horror, I don't think it lands. I don't think you go, oh, okay, here's the real consequences of what happens when humans interact with each other this way. But if it's a horrific text, then you can't ignore it, right? You go like, oh, wow, that is consequential. It's similar to, and I think actually I'm pretty sure at some point I quote her in the podcast, I can't remember, but Flannery O'Connor, right? So she is well known for writing basically Southern Gothic horror is what some people call it. And her phrase is something, I'm going to butcher it a little bit, but it's something like to the deaf you shout, and to the blind you draw large and startling figures. And what I think she was getting at is sometimes you have to make the sort of grotesque, macabre, dark, terrifying elements of life painted in even sharper relief because you are communicating to a readership that is sort of numb, blind, and deaf to some of those realities. And you almost have to scream your message to waken them up. And so that's, I think, what the hope of the podcast is saying, if we can do that with both scripture, but also with our own lives. And then these films kind of give us a way to practice that of recognizing the horror for what it is, and then coming back into our life and saying, how does that actually inform the way that I understand the horrors today?
Yeah, no, that's good. And I love that you quoted Flannery O'Connor. That was one of my major professors, like go-to people, and having to read her work. And it's shocking. I mean, I remember I was TAing a grad class, and one of the students read it, and they had to analyze A Good Man Is Hard to Find, her short story. And like in the review, this is the devil, this is the devil. Like they couldn't even call themselves down to like do an analysis of it. And she is writing to this audience that she calls the Christ-haunted South, where people are so what you might call culturally Christian, but the Christian message, the really embodied life of faith is not really, happening. And so she writes these stories to kind of shock people out of their complacency. And they're tough stories to read, just like some of the stories in the Bible. And this dovetails into a question I wanted to ask you, because I'm sure you've gotten this, and you already kind of answered it, but I want to kind of hit it head on. I get this passage a lot, Philippians 4:8, whatever is good, noble, pure, beautiful, true, think on those things, and whenever this subject comes up, and even outside of the horror genre, even fiction in general, we're just like, don't look at that, just stick with what these things are. When people kind of throw that Philippians 4:8 grenade at you, how do you respond to that?
Well, it is similar to what I'd said before, of basically you can't ignore the true. Like Philippians starts with whatever's good and true. And I think the quintessential for me, if you're a person of Christian faith, the truest thing that we can say about reality is what happened to God incarnate on the cross, right? And this is a moment of grotesque, horrific treatment of a human body, of not even just a human body, but a human community, couched in this sort of like crazy political, spiritual kind of climate. And nothing about that would we say is beautiful. Well, actually, we would say it's beautiful, but nothing about that would be, pure or polite or pleasant, right? It's grotesque and difficult and terrifying and obscene in some ways. And yet nobody is saying, well, actually, no one is saying, turn your eyes away from that, right? No one is saying, don't look at that. In fact, the Christian tradition says that is the core of what happened, what God did in the world. So if that's the case, then it simply cannot be that it's only pleasantries that we're called to reflect on. And that's, just the one example. There are all sorts of other examples getting to the biblical text of like, these are some pretty rough things that because they're true, we're called to not just recognize them, but meditate on them. I mean, that's the weird thing. We're to meditate on these stories that are intense and horrific. I mean, the rest of the Gospels has all sorts of stuff. I mean, like you have demon possessions and people, the Walking Dead, if you think of Lazarus as this is really, what is that? Right. And all sorts of really difficult, troubling stories. So that's generally where I go. The interesting thing is when I kind of paused just now and said, no one's saying, look away from the cross. The truth is actually that is endemic to the Christian tradition, not just in the US right now, but in historically this would be, Luther's theology of the cross versus theology of glory, right? There is a tendency in light of the resurrection, we'll say, that Christians actually want to ignore that horror. And they want to think of a sort of triumphalist Christ, a glorified Christ, without that being the product and result of the suffering Christ on the cross, right? And I think when that gets detached, we actually see a lot of pretty significant distortions within the Christian faith and Christian people because they take up my cross, is now no longer a part of the lexicon. It's simply, we are triumphalists and glorified kind of visions as opposed to that sort of dark and brooding vision. So that's where I go. Again, it doesn't always convince everybody. They still, I think some people, their gut instinct is no, bad, run away. But that's how I respond.
No, that's really, really good. And I think you bring up an important point where it's almost like we interpret Paul's words is sort of like a media aesthetics critique. And that's not really there's a lot of truth that's not aesthetically beautiful. It might be beautiful in what it means, but it's not like something we would necessarily like to, put in our children's nursery and hang that, bloodied picture, on the wall.
A scholar that I really love, her name is Cecilia Gonzalez Andrew. She wrote a book called Bridge to Wonder. She's a Roman Catholic theologian, but it was either in that book or in maybe a lecture. And she says, the opposite of beauty is not ugliness. She says the opposite of beauty is glamour. And what she means is even ugly things, something like the cross, things that we would say are grotesque and ugly, they actually are centrifugal. Like they spin out and spin you out toward the capital B beauty, right? They point you away from itself towards beauties. But there are other things, and this is what she calls glamour, things that are sort of inward. They're centripetal, right? They can't help but be sort of inward facing, and they don't actually push you towards something greater or higher or different. It's just a sort of self-serving thing. And there are versions of horror film or anything out there that really are that. They get caught in this sort of like inward turning spiral that doesn't actually lead to anything good or true or beautiful. So those cases really do exist, and I don't want to deny them, but I'm not going to take those cases and then just, paint with a broad brush over all the others, because there are horrors, there are ugliness that can actually point toward beauty. And that's why I think the cross is actually a really great, perfect example of what we mean when we talk in those ways.
So moving on a little bit, Jason Bivens wrote an excellent book called Religion of Fear. And in the book, he gives several case studies on how the same Christians who condemn Hollywood horrors use the same tactics he gives examples of Jack Chick cartoons, Left Behind novels, and I would say, I don't want to say all Christians, but a certain flavor of Christianity's spin and take on the haunted house called Hell House or Judgment House. And in my own tradition, I've seen evangelists who, decry Halloween and things like spiritualism and the occult, but they use the same graphics and narrative strategies taken from the realms they condemn. So do you see a type of hypocrisy at work in how Christians critique society's darker elements, as well as how they ignore their own role in producing various horror tropes?
I mean, yes. I think I have at least one, maybe there might be two episodes where I kind of touch on this a little bit. And I talked to a guy that's kind of a Left Behind expert, essentially, and really more an expert on evangelical literature, like the subculture that comes in. But it's interesting because I think you're absolutely right that there's a hypocrisy there, or maybe just a willful blindness or unawareness. I don't know. But my concern with like the hell houses and everything else, and this actually gets to the reason why I guess I ended up titling it the Be Afraid, is because what I think is happening there is that the hypocrisy is that you're leveraging the same kind of fear to persuade or proselytize that actually should be rejected, right? So it's exploiting something that really works, right? Like fear is powerful, and the kinds of things generally in those examples you gave, it's almost exclusively the fear of hell, right? Like eternal conscious torment, like you will, and that's a pretty scary thing, right? And wow, psychologically, there's something there that's powerful. I think in my mind, the way that I think theologically is that is sub-Christian, compelling someone toward the love of Jesus based upon a terror of eternal conscious torment isn't really great, right? It's a sort of like counterproductive in some ways, or actually sub-Christian, as I said. But the reason I named the podcast Be Afraid along these lines is because I went into it, and again, thinking like I have hesitations with horror just personally. And one of the questions was, what is it that makes me so uneasy and makes me afraid in those films? I thought the story was going to go something like perfect love casts out fear, right? Like there's something about the message of Jesus that you actually, at a certain point, you can face fears, you can go into them, but because you're kind of connected to this vision of love, that will eliminate fear, right? Like you'll find out, oh, you don't have anything to fear. And then you have all these passages in the Bible of like, fear not, God is with you, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So that's where I thought it was going. But then at some point I started realizing like, well, wait a minute, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And you see this over and over and over as well. And I started thinking like, well, wait a minute, maybe it's not fear per se that is the problem. Maybe the problem is that we're afraid of the wrong things. And part of at least Christian discipleship is learning how to fear rightly. And so the Be Afraid thing really came from, well, what would it look like if horror films and experience of this helps steer our fears toward the one that we should fear, right? Here's right. Paul again, right? Don't fear the one who can just destroy your flesh, but the one who can just destroy your flesh and soul, right? So fear God. This is who you should fear. So I think back to your point about the hell houses and things, it's not just that they're exploiting fear. Or directing fear, as I would say. It's that they are actually fearing the wrong things. And they're putting at the core of the Christian faith things that actually we shouldn't be afraid of, all the while missing what it means to actually fear God rightly. And I think that's where the hypocrisy comes in, is both critiquing Hollywood for that same thing and completely missing how it is that fear might operate within the Christian faith.
That's good. That's good. It's a lot to think about. Before we continue our discussion looking at Beetlejuice more specifically, it's good to take a break to bury some ideas in our brains. First, not only recognizing the Bible's inclusion of frightening stories, but allowing them to be frightening or terrifying. For those who take the words of Scripture, including all its many genres from poetry to lament, seriously, we need to allow the modes of communication chosen to work on us as intended instead of explaining them away or sanitizing them. I'm reminded of the words of my major professor, Ben Fraser, who points out that people are affective before they are cognitive. We feel as well as think our way through the world. To remove the affective elements of a narrative and reduce it to stale propositional truth bleeds the power out of a story, whether it's happy or horrific. Second, it's good to remember that dark and scary things can be very true and worthy of engagement, while at the same time recognizing that with any genre, there are dark and scary things that are untrue and not worthy of consideration. The work of critique and discernment is work, and like a muscle, it needs to be developed so we can engage in texts that challenge us in positive ways and discard the ones that just take our money and time. In this episode, Kutter highlighted our triumphant tendency of skipping over the horror of the cross and heading right to the resurrection. While I think it's possible to emphasize the cross in a way that casts a shadow over the resurrection, the point is that many of us tend to avoid the realities of suffering in favor of a quick fix. The cross simultaneously shows us the horror of sin and the beauty of God's love, indicating that just because something at first glance is visceral or sad or terrifying doesn't mean it can't also reveal what is good. Finally, the idea of fear in religion is a subject scarier than a sandworm. Cutter's point that certain ministries aren't so much exploiting fears as directing them to the wrong place is worth mulling over. A fear of hell and demons isn't to be our focus, but rather, as Kutter notes, God who has the power over life and destruction of the soul. And this fear isn't raw terror, though the Bible certainly records moments of frightful encounters with the divine, but perhaps a healthy respect for the otherness and awesomeness of God, who, according to many verses in the Bible, is on our side. In our next episode, we will delve more specifically into Beetlejuice and what it might have to teach us about life and death. Thank you for listening to Beast and Bible.
Beast and Bible is written, researched, produced, and hosted by Dr. Seth Pierce. Ethan Geck is our editor. Logo design and social media by Chelsea Ernina. Equipment and tech help from the dynamic duo James Gigante and Stephen Husett. Producing and project help from me, Heather Moore. Thanks for listening to Beast and Bible. Tell your friends about us, and don't forget to leave a nightlight on after dark.